You know the portrait. You've seen it. Everyone has seen it, even if they don't know they've seen it. It ends up on book covers and museum postcards and those expensive wall calendars they sell in gift shops next to the refrigerator magnets. A king. The king. Standing in the pose that all kings secretly want to stand in but almost none ever achieve. One hand resting on a sceptre taller than a grown man. The other hand on his hip, loose, casual, like he just thought of something funny and is deciding whether to share it. His cloak, and I need to emphasize the word cloak here, is not a cloak. It is an event. Blue velvet, the colour of a winter sky 6 minutes before full dark, lined with white ermine fur in a fleur-de-lis pattern so precise and so regular that you'd assume a machine made it, except machines didn't exist yet. The cloak pools behind him onto the floor in a wave of impossible fabric. His stockings are white. His legs in those stockings are the legs of a man who has been told his entire life that his legs are extraordinary, and has believed it, and has spent 70 years making sure everyone around him agrees. He is Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the absolute monarch of the most powerful nation in Europe, the man who built Versailles, the man who personally approved every painting, every statue, every piece of architecture that bore his likeness. The man who understood before anyone else that image was not a supplement to power. Image was power. The portrait was painted in 1701 by Hyacinthe Rigaud. Louis is 63 years old in it. He looks magnificent. He looks immortal. He looks like a man who has never been sick a day in his life, who's never been cold or hungry or frightened or in pain. He looks like a piece of theatre, perfect and complete and completely deliberate. Now let me tell you what was underneath. His breath. Let's start with his breath, because that's always where the truth starts, isn't it? Not with the velvet, not with the ermine, with the breath. By 1701, Louis XIV's breath could clear a room, not metaphorically, literally. The King of France, the absolute ruler of 20 million people, the man whose lightest word could end careers and begin wars. When he spoke to you, you held your breath, not out of reverence, out of self-preservation. His teeth were gone, most of them. What the court dentists had started, the court physicians had finished. The extractions had been catastrophic. Medieval dentistry being what it was, several of the extractions had taken portions of his jawbone with them, creating passages between his mouth and his nasal cavity that were never supposed to exist. He ate soup mostly. He ate soup, and he drank wine, and occasionally he ate soft meats, and the food sometimes came back through his nose, and this was the Sun King. This was the man in the portrait. Picture a building the size of a small city. Fill it with 4,000 people who mostly share 4 bathrooms. Add the smell of 16,000 candles burning every night in a space with almost no ventilation. Add perfume, industrial quantities of it, applied to bodies that haven't been properly washed in weeks, in some cases months. Add the smell of the kitchen serving 300 dishes at every meal. Add the horses. The stables at Versailles housed hundreds of horses, and the wind from the stables came through in summer with a warmth that had nothing to do with sunshine. Add underneath all of that the particular smell of a man whose body was at war with itself, a body that has been operated on 14 years prior for an anal fistula, a procedure performed without anaesthesia in front of an audience of physicians, after which the royal surgeons received promotions and the surgeon-in-chief was ennobled and given land, because that is what happens when you successfully cut into the backside of the King of France and he survives. That's Versailles. That's the place we're going tonight. Not as tourists, not as art historians pointing at the Hall of Mirrors and saying magnificent. We're living it. We're grinding the lapis lazuli into powder. We're mixing the lead white into the oil. We're standing in the corner of a room where the most powerful man in Europe holds still for 20 minutes while we try to capture, in paint on canvas, something he will never actually be again. We're telling the most beautiful lie of the 17th century. So, get comfortable. I make these history stories, and I genuinely don't know if anyone listens to them for sleep or if you're all just fascinated by the particular horror of court life, the way kings smelled, the gap between the painting and the man. Either way. Subscribe if you want. Here we go. Your name is Jean-Baptiste Morel. You're 17 years old. You arrived in Paris from Lyon 6 months ago with a letter of recommendation from a provincial drawing master. A bundle of clothes and hands that have been stained with pigment since you were 9 years old. The letter got you a position in the workshop of Pierre Bertin, a painter of middling reputation and enormous social ambition. Bertin paints portraits of wealthy merchants, their wives, their daughters, their horses. He paints the horses particularly well. He is proud of the horses. He has told you this twice. What he has not told you, what you pieced together over your first weeks in Paris from overheard conversations and stolen glances at correspondence, is that Bertin has spent the last 3 years quietly cultivating a relationship with a minor functionary in the household of Hyacinthe Rigaud. Hyacinthe Rigaud. The name means something specific in Paris. It means the royal portraitist, first painter to the king, the man whose studio on the Rue Saint-Honoré is less a workshop and more a factory of prestige, producing the official image of Louis XIV and distributing it by commission and by copy to courts, churches, town halls, and noble houses across France and across Europe. If your face is in a Rigaud portrait, you matter. If your face isn't, you might not. And Bertin, through his minor functionary, has managed to secure for one apprentice from his workshop a 3-month placement in Rigaud's studio, an assistant's position, a chance to grind pigments and prepare canvases and hold things and carry things and watch from a respectful distance how the greatest portrait painter of the century operates. He gave the position to you. You're still not sure why. You suspect it's because you're quiet. You've learned that quiet is a form of currency in workshops. A master who doesn't have to explain things twice, who doesn't hear complaints, who isn't asked questions that interrupt his concentration, is a master who works faster and thinks more clearly. You figured this out early in your apprenticeship with the drawing master in Lyon. You kept your mouth closed and your eyes open, and you learned twice as fast as the boy beside you who asked questions constantly. Quiet, observant, fast hands. That's what got you here. Here being the courtyard of Versailles on a Tuesday morning in October 1701, with the portrait of the king having been completed the previous spring, and the aftermath of that portrait still rippling through everything, the copies being requested by ambassadors, the variations being discussed, the arguments about whether the pose correctly conveyed gravitas, whether the sceptre was angled correctly, whether the light on the ermine suggested the appropriate weight of divine authority. You haven't slept properly in 3 days because the journey from Paris to Versailles, which should take 4 hours by coach, took 8, because the road is a disaster, because it rained, because one of the horses threw a shoe outside of Sèvres, because 3 other coaches were also trying to get to Versailles with varying degrees of urgency, and the road narrowed to single file for almost a mile. Your spine feels like it's been assembled wrong. Your neck hurts in a way that suggests the neck is considering resignation. Your shoes, which seemed adequate in Paris, have developed an opinion about the mud that is entirely their own. You're standing in the first courtyard of the Palace of Versailles, holding a wooden case of brushes and a rolled canvas that Bertin insisted you carry personally, because it's for Rigaud, because nothing for Rigaud goes in the baggage cart, and you're looking up, just looking, because whatever you were expecting, and you were expecting something extraordinary. You've been told about Versailles your entire life. Painters talk about nothing else when they think about royal commissions. Whatever you were expecting is not this. It's not one building. That's the first thing. You knew Versailles was large. You did not understand that large here meant something it doesn't mean anywhere else. The palace faces you with a facade that doesn't end. You turn your head left, still building. Turn your head right, still building. The windows are identical and they go on, and there are 750 of them, and you will learn this number later from a man in Rigaud's studio who knows these things. But right now you don't know the number, and it doesn't matter because the effect is the same. This thing was not built for humans. It was built for a concept. The concept of a king who contains all of France within himself, and France is large, and so the building is large, and the windows keep going, and there is no logical stopping point, and nobody expected you to find one. The smell hits you about 30 seconds after the sight. This is how Versailles works. You will learn. It gives you the sight first. It gives you the gold and the marble and the fountains and the perfect geometry of the gardens stretching away behind the palace to the horizon. It gives you the sight in order to prepare you, or not prepare you, because nothing prepares you, for the smell. It's not one smell either. It's layers. Horse first, always horse. The grand stables and the petite stables together house over 2,000 horses, and the wind comes from the wrong direction this morning and carries the full force of that fact directly into your face. Not unpleasant exactly. You grew up around horses, you know the smell, it's honest, but overwhelming in scale. This is not one horse. This is the idea of horse pressed into air. Under the horse, something floral, not natural. Nothing about this smell is natural. It's the perfume of 4,000 people who wear it not as a luxury but as a necessity, because bathing at Versailles is complicated and relatively rare, and the alternative to perfume is an honesty that nobody at court can afford. Rose water and musk and civet. Civet being, if you don't know, a substance scraped from a gland near the hindquarters of a small cat-like animal, and worth almost as much as gold, which tells you something about how much the people here needed to smell of something other than themselves. Under the perfume, something sharper, something that catches at the back of your throat and makes you want to cough. Candles, thousands of them, burned every night in every hallway and salon and private apartment. The wax and tallow residue builds up in the draperies and on the ceilings and in the air itself. You walk into a room at Versailles that hasn't been properly aired, and your eyes water before you've taken 3 steps. And underneath all of that, deep underneath, the kind of smell that doesn't announce itself but that you realise after 5 minutes has been there the whole time, sewage, human waste. There are 100,000 people in and around Versailles on any given day. The sanitation infrastructure was built for a hunting lodge. The modifications since then have not kept pace. People relieve themselves in corridors, behind curtains, in stairwells. The courtiers, dressed in their best silks, pick their way around the evidence of this with the practiced grace of people who have learned to ignore it. A footman is already sweeping something near the main entrance. He doesn't look up when you pass him. You enter the building. Rigaud's working space at Versailles is not in the palace proper. It's in one of the outbuildings, the north wing, up a staircase that smells of fresh plaster and old paint, through a door that sticks and has to be pushed with your shoulder. The room beyond is large and cold and full of light from two enormous north-facing windows, and it smells exactly like every painter's studio you've ever been in. Linseed oil and turpentine and the sharp mineral smell of dry pigment and something underneath that is hard to name. The accumulated creative effort of 1,000 works begun and abandoned and completed and sent away. Rigaud himself is not here when you arrive. This is, you will learn, normal. Rigaud operates on a schedule that is his own, determined by the rhythms of the court and the availability of his subjects and his own considerable energies, and that schedule occasionally includes the hours when other people expect him. What is here when you arrive is the studio, and what is in the studio tells you everything about how this place operates. First, the canvases. Rolled and stacked along one wall, in various stages of completion. Some are portraits in progress, faces blocked in, bodies sketched but not resolved, hands that are rough shapes waiting to become specific. Others appear finished, varnished, waiting for collection. You count 8 finished portraits in the time it takes you to cross the room. 8 in this room alone. Second, the drawings. The walls between the windows are covered in them. Studies, quick sketches, a hand, a chin, the fall of fabric across a shoulder. More finished drawings in chalk of faces you half recognise from coins and engravings. These are the petits patrons, the small studies that become the reference points for the large canvases. Third, and this is the thing that stops you, the mannequin. It stands in the centre of the room on a low platform dressed in royal robes, blue velvet, white ermine, the fleur-de-lis pattern, high-heeled shoes that add 4 inches to its height, a wig, dark, elaborate, cascading in perfect curls over the velvet shoulders. The mannequin has no face. It's a wooden armature, padded to the correct proportions, dressed with what appears to be the actual ceremonial garments of the King of France, and it stands there in the October light from the north windows with the posture of absolute authority. This is how royal portraits are painted, not all at once, not with the king standing still for 40 hours while the artist works. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute monarch, the man with a schedule more complex than most military campaigns. Louis XIV gave Rigaud roughly 4 sessions for the face. The face, 90 minutes each, maybe 2 hours, with courtiers present and the light correct and the king in a state of what passed for patience. Everything else, the body, the costume, the hands, the legs in their magnificent stockings, the sweep of that imperial cloak, came from the mannequin, and from models, and from memory, and from a kind of practiced collective agreement about what a king's body should look like, regardless of what it actually looked like underneath. The hands in the portrait, for example, were painted from a model. A young nobleman whose hands we considered particularly good, long-fingered, elegant, unscarred. Louis's actual hands at 63 were the hands of a man who had ridden horses his entire life, which are not elegant hands. They're strong and slightly gnarled and marked with decades of grip and weather. Beautiful in their way, not portrait hands, Not these portrait hands, the legs, those magnificent legs in white silk stockings, one slightly forward in that famous dancer's pose, were painted from a combination of the mannequin and memory, and, according to the man who will tell you this later, in a tone of absolute matter-of-factness, from a young soldier in the Royal Guard whose legs were considered architecturally correct for the image the king wanted to project. Louis had been a dancer in his youth, an extraordinary dancer actually. There's a version of his life story where this is the central fact, where the young king's obsession with ballet and his body and the performance of authority are all connected in ways that go very deep. He danced in court masks from the age of 13. He created the role of Apollo, the sun god, the origin of his own mythology, in a ballet when he was 14. He was good. He was trained. His body in those years was something he had worked on and presented to the world with the deliberate artistry of a performer. By 1701 he is 63 and he doesn't dance anymore. He stopped dancing in his 30s, quietly, without announcement, and if you ask why, the official answer is that the demands of governance made such leisure impossible, and the unofficial answer, whispered in the corridors of the North Wing, is that the body that had been his greatest asset was changing in ways that made the performance unsustainable. So Rigaud paints the legs he should have had, the hands he might have had, the posture of a man 40 years younger, preserved in oil and linseed, and a very particular agreement between the painter and his patron and the world. And you're here to watch how it's done. His name is Gaspard. He's the senior assistant in Rigaud's studio, 24 years old, from Montpellier originally, with paint-stained fingers that he never quite gets clean, and a way of talking about painting that is entirely practical and almost entirely without romance. You will spend more time with Gaspard in the next 3 months than with anyone else, and you will learn more from him than from Rigaud himself, which is not a slight to Rigaud but simply a fact about how workshops function. Gaspard finds you standing in front of the mannequin when he comes in. He stands beside you for a moment, looks at the mannequin, looks at you looking at the mannequin. First time, he asks. Is it obvious? You have the face. He takes your brush case from you without asking and puts it on the workbench, starts unpacking it. His movements are quick and certain. A man who has handled other people's brushes enough times to know by weight and flex what's good and what isn't. They all have the face the first time. The mannequin is hard to look at if you're still thinking about it correctly. Thinking about it correctly meaning what? Meaning as a deception. He holds one of your brushes up to the light, examines the tip, puts it down. After a while, you stop thinking about it that way. You start thinking about it as a solution. The king's time is worth, what would you say? Something extraordinary. Every minute he stands here is a minute he's not governing France. So you take 4 sessions for the face, which is the only part that matters, and you build the rest from references. It's practical. And if the references don't match the king, Gaspard looks at you, not a hostile look, a measuring look, the look of someone deciding how honest to be with someone new. The references, he says, are the king. He goes back to organising the brushes. The king as he should be, the king as France requires him to be. Rigaud doesn't paint accidents or contingencies or the specific damage of time. He paints the office, the institution, the thing that exists beyond the particular man who holds it. He pauses. You'll understand when you see him. See the king? See the portrait. See both. Then you'll understand the difference between the two and why the portrait has to be what it is. He hands you an apron, points at a stack of canvases that need to be primed. Start with those, 2 coats of ground, the first thin, let it dry, the second thicker. And don't rush the drying. If you rush the drying, I'll know, and you'll do it again. You take the apron, tie it on, reach for the pot of gesso. Your first morning in Versailles, you prime canvases. Your hands already know this work. The brush moving in even strokes top to bottom, the resistance of the unprimed canvas giving way as the ground soaks in, the particular drag and release of the bristles over texture. You've done this hundreds of times. It's meditative work. Work that requires enough attention to occupy the hands, but leaves the mind free to drift. Your mind drifts to the mannequin. It's still there on its platform, blue velvet and white ermine, watching the room with its blank wooden face. 3 days after you arrive, you see the king. This is not planned. Rigaud had a session scheduled and then the session was postponed. A matter of state, Gaspard said, which is what people at Versailles say when they don't know what happened and can't ask, and then unexpectedly rescheduled for the same afternoon, and there's no time to send you away, and Rigaud doesn't want to halt work on the canvas he's been preparing, and so you stay. You stay in the corner of the room, behind Gaspard, hands clasped, quiet. This is the thing you are good at. Louis XIV enters with 6 people. 2 of them are guards standing at the door. 2 are courtiers, men whose function seems to be primarily to exist near the king and react appropriately to whatever he says. 1 is a physician, a small man with ink stains on his cuffs and an expression of perpetual slight anxiety. And 1 is the first gentleman of the bedchamber, a tall nobleman in his 50s, who moves with the particular precision of a man who has spent decades managing the physical logistics of another person's existence. And then there is the king. You've seen his portraits your entire life. You've seen them in churches, in public buildings, in the homes of wealthy merchants who want to signal their loyalty, in the workshop of your drawing master in Lyon, who had a small engraving tacked above his desk. You know what the king looks like. You have the portrait in your head with the completeness of something you memorize without meaning to. The man who walks into Rigaud's studio is not that portrait. He is not unimpressive. That is the first thing to register, that he enters with an authority that is not simply performed, that exists in the way he moves through space as if the space has been designed for him, which, here, it has. He walks slowly with a slight stiffness, and you will learn later that this is partly the high-heeled shoes. He has worn them since his 20s. They are part of his image, a necessary architecture. But 63 years in high-heeled shoes do things to ankles and calves, and the whole system of balance. And you can see it subtly in how he places each foot, and partly the residue of older injuries and older surgeries, and the general protest of a body that has been worked hard for 6 decades. He is not tall. The portrait suggests tall. The shoes give him height that the portrait then records as natural. Without them, and you will see him once, months later, in circumstances that are private, and he will not be wearing them. He's a man of middling height, shorter than you. His face is Louis's face. That part is accurate. The long nose, the heavy-lidded eyes that Rigaud painted with such intelligence, the sense of a mind behind them that is always calculating, always weighing. The wig. Today a full dark wig, the curls arranged with geometric precision, frames a face that is showing its age in the specific way of a face that has been very carefully maintained for decades. The skin is powdered. The white lead foundation is applied with great skill, smoothing and evening the complexion, filling the small marks and lines that accumulate on any face over 60 years. The colour is correct. The image is correct. But you are close enough in this small room to see the powder, to see where it sits in the creases that the powder cannot fully conceal, to see the slight irregularity in the jaw where the bone is no longer quite right. When he speaks, first to Rigaud, something brief and formal about the continuation of the work, you hear it, not obviously, not grotesquely, but you hear the slight sibilance, the way the absent teeth change the shape of certain sounds. The court has adapted to it. Rigaud doesn't flinch. The courtiers don't flinch. The physician looks at the floor. You look at your hands. You are painting this man. Not directly. You will never put a brush to the royal portrait itself, but you're in the workshop that is painting this man, grinding the pigments, preparing the canvases, priming the grounds on which the image will be built. You are part of the machinery that produces the Sun King, and the Sun King, standing 6 feet from you in the October light, smells of roses and musk and something medicinal underneath, and his jaw is slightly wrong, and his ankles hurt inside his shoes. He holds the pose for 40 minutes. Rigaud works quickly, precise and efficient, moving between the face on the canvas and the face in front of him with the concentration of a man who has done this many times and knows exactly what he's looking for. Small adjustments, the way the light falls on the cheekbone, the precise angle of the eyes. Rigaud talks to the king occasionally. Observations, questions about comfort, small pieces of conversation designed to keep the face alive and present, rather than frozen into the blankness that prolonged stillness produces. The king answers. The courtiers wait. The physician stands with his hands behind his back. You don't breathe much. At the end of 40 minutes, the king gestures, something barely visible, a slight movement of the hand, and the first gentleman steps forward and the session is over. The king leaves the way he came in, with his 6 people around him, and the room rearranges itself in his absence. Rigaud puts down his brushes, looks at the canvas, then looks at you. You stayed still, he says. Good. He goes back to the canvas. Gaspard hands you a cloth. Mouth, he says. You realise you've bitten the inside of your cheek without noticing. You wipe your mouth. The first time is like that, Gaspard says, turning back to his own work. It gets easier. You look at the canvas, at the face taking shape there, the face you just saw in the room, in the flesh, 6 feet from you, with its powder and its careful construction and its 63 years of accumulated history. And then at the portrait on the other side of the studio, the completed one, the 1701 masterpiece, the Sun King in his ermine and his glory, the same face, the same eyes, the same nose, not the same man. This is the thing you will spend 3 months learning to hold in your head, not the same man. The preparation of a royal portrait, and by preparation I don't mean the canvas, I mean the king, is a process that makes the painting itself look simple. You learn about it in pieces. Gaspard tells you some of it. You observe some of it. One afternoon, a man named Marchais, who has worked in the royal household for 20 years and seems to find it amusing to educate young painters on what they don't know, sits down next to you in the corridor where you're eating bread and tells you the rest. The king's morning begins at a specific time and follows a specific sequence that has been formalized into something approaching liturgy. This is the lever, the rising, and it is not a private moment. It is a ceremony, a performance, a daily ritual of power that the king himself invented and that has been running, with minor variations, for the better part of 40 years. It begins in darkness. The royal bedchamber at 6 in the morning is lit by candles, low, warm, throwing shadows that obscure more than they reveal. The king sleeps in a bed that is enormous and canopied and surrounded by a balustrade, beyond which a small number of designated individuals are permitted to stand. The doctors, the first gentlemen. One or two of the highest-ranking nobility who have earned the right to witness the king's awakening as a mark of extraordinary favour. The first valet de chambre wakes the king with a phrase, precise, formal, the same phrase every morning. Sire, it is time. Not good morning. Not you need to get up. Sire, it is time, because the king doesn't get up. Time comes to the king and announces itself, and then it begins. First, the physicians. They examine the king before he is fully awake, check his pulse, note the colour of his complexion, inquire about the night. There have been bad nights. Nights when the fistula, the old wound from the operation of 1686, produces discomfort that no amount of court dignity can conceal. The physicians have learned to conduct these examinations with a discretion so complete it functions as invisibility. They touch, they observe, they make their notes, and they step back, and the information they carry is recorded in books that no one outside a very small circle will ever read. Then, the wig. You have to understand the wig. Louis XIV began losing his hair at roughly 20 years old. This was not unusual. Male pattern baldness was then as now distributed generously through the aristocracy. But for Louis, whose body had been his primary instrument of political theatre since his teenage years, losing his hair was not a cosmetic inconvenience. It was a crisis of imagery. His hair was part of the portrait he'd been painting of himself since boyhood. The long, dark, curling hair of the young Sun King, of the dancer Apollo, of the man whose physical presence was designed to overwhelm. He had wig makers, the best in France. A corps of them, with the official title of perruquier du roi, royal wig makers, who maintained and constructed and repaired the collection of wigs that served as the king's hair for the last 4 decades of his life. The collection was extensive, different wigs for different occasions, different wigs for different seasons. The formal wig, tall, elaborate, dark, cascading, for ceremonial occasions, simpler wigs for private mournings, travel wigs for the carriages. The wigs were made from human hair. This was the standard material for the finest wigs, and the finest wig makers sourced their hair from a supply chain that went across France and occasionally beyond, buying long hair from women who needed the money and couldn't afford to keep it. A woman in Brittany cuts her hair in the winter, sells it to a middleman. The middleman sells it to a Parisian wig maker. The Parisian wig maker weaves it onto a silk base and curls it with hot irons and dresses it with powder and sells it to the palace, and it ends up on the head of the King of France. The wig that goes on Louis's head in the morning is placed by the second gentleman, who holds it at the precise angles that long practice has established as correct. The king tilts his head slightly. The wig is lowered, adjusted, pinned. The king straightens, and the transformation, and it is a transformation, even after 40 years of it remains visually remarkable. The transformation is complete. He is the Sun King again, whatever The morning's examination found under the surface is now correct. Then the face. The application of the royal face is performed by specialists, and it is not quick work, and it covers a great deal. The foundation is white lead, ground fine and mixed with fat and rose water. You know this compound. You use a version of it in the studio. It's the same chemistry, lead carbonate, brilliant white, heavy, smooth, capable of covering almost anything if applied correctly. Applied to the face, it creates the smooth, uniform pallor that appears in every portrait of every nobleman and noblewoman of the century. That particular theatrical white that has nothing to do with health or youth and everything to do with image. What it covers, the redness of broken capillaries, the brownish marks left by years of outdoor life, by riding, by the particular damage of a body that has spent decades in different climates, the unevenness of skin that has been through illness, and Louis has been through illness more than the official record admits, smallpox as a child that left its marks, the aftermath of the fistula, fevers in the intervening years, the ordinary violence of a 17th century body navigating a 17th century world. It also covers, as much as it can, the lines, the age, the specific geography of a face that has laughed and frowned and concentrated and grieved for 63 years. The lead is toxic, by the way, not slowly toxic, not the kind of toxic that takes decades to show, the kind of toxic that builds up and eventually contributes to the deterioration of exactly the body it was meant to preserve. The women who applied it daily for years developed the tremors. The pallor of the lead eventually became their own pallor, permanent and irreversible, their bodies absorbing the poison that was supposed to paint them immortal. The king uses it every morning, has used it every morning for decades. The physicians note the effects with their careful discretion and record them in their private books. On top of the lead, rouge, the specific red of the cheek, placed precisely, blended with the skill of an artist, because this too is art, is portraiture, is the daily creation of an image, the rouge that suggests the healthy colour of a man half his age, real colour applied over the illusion of perfect skin, and then the patches, black patches, small pieces of silk or velvet cut into shapes, circles, crescents, stars, and adhered to the face at locations determined by fashion and by the specific needs of concealment, a beauty mark, an accent, a focal point that draws the eye here and away from there. They serve a function beyond decoration, and everyone knows it, and no one says it. A patch placed high on the cheekbone is elegant. A patch placed over a scar, over a mark, over something the court has agreed not to acknowledge, is invisible. The final step is the powder, starch mostly, dusted over everything with a fine brush to set the foundation, to absorb the last of the oils, to give the whole construction the matte finish that appears in the portraits. The white powder clouds up briefly in the air of the bedchamber and settles, and the men in the room breathe it in, and the first gentleman blinks it from his eyes, and the king is ready. He is then dressed, which is its own ceremony with its own hierarchy and its own rituals, the various garments passed from hand to hand in precise order of precedence. The chemise first, handed by the highest-ranking nobleman present, then the coat, then the shoes, then the sword, each stage an opportunity for the court to express its devotion by proximity, by the honour of proximity, by being the hand that held the shirt or the voice that offered the prayer. By the time Louis XIV walks into Rigaud's studio for a portrait session, he has been under construction for approximately 3 hours. The smell in the studio changes when pigments are being ground. This is something you know from Lyon, and it remains true here. The process of reducing raw materials to workable paint has a particular suite of smells that is nothing like the smell of the finished work. Linseed oil heated slightly to improve flow, turpentine for dilution, sharp and piney and slightly dizzying if the room isn't aired, the heavy mineral cold of malachite being worked under the muller, the faintly rotten sweetness of vermilion, mercury sulfide, brilliant red, unstable in some conditions, the pigment that turns black when it meets the wrong environment, the great failure waiting in 100 old paintings. You grind pigments for Rigaud the way you ground pigments for Bertin, and before that for the drawing master in Lyon. Systematically, methodically, testing the fineness of the powder between your thumb and forefinger, feeling for the graininess that means more work, feeling for the butter-smooth result that means the pigment is ready. Your knuckles are red by mid-morning most days from the cold and the work. Your fingertips have a faint blue-grey stain from the smalt that doesn't come out with soap. Gaspard shows you the colours Rigaud uses for skin. This is the technical heart of portrait painting, and it is considerably more complex than it looks in the finished work. The skin you see in the completed portrait, the unified, seemingly simple tone of a face, is built from 6 or 8 distinct colours applied in layers, each layer affecting the one above it, the whole system creating a depth and translucency that a single flat colour cannot achieve. Lead white for the lights, yellow ochre in the mid-tones, red lake glazes for warmth, a touch of smalt in the shadows for the cool blue-grey that appears in the hollows of the face, burnt umber for the deepest shadows under the chin, behind the ear, sometimes a glaze of yellow varnish over everything at the end to unify and warm. The secret, Gaspard says, putting a small amount of red lake on the palette and indicating the transparent quality of it when held to the light, is that you're not painting a face, you're painting light moving through skin. Skin is not opaque. Blood is under the skin. Structure is under the blood. You're painting all of it, in layers, the way light actually encounters a face. You pick up the lake and hold it to the north window. It glows red-orange, like a coal. And when the face you're painting has been covered with a white leaden rouge, Gaspard takes the glass back. Then you paint what the face should look like without those things. You paint the blood, the structure, the light under the skin, even when the skin underneath is 63 years old. Even when, he says, especially when. This is the job, to see through the construction, through the wig, the powder, the rouge, the patches, the high shoes, the formal robes, to find the image of what the man was, and what the office requires him to be, and what France needs him to appear as, and then to paint that. To paint not the lie and not the truth, but the thing between them that a kingdom can hold in its head and feel something about. You spend a long time thinking about this while you grind the pigments. The muller goes in circles, and the colour changes under it, and your knuckles ache. There are things about Versailles that nobody told you before you came here, and that you couldn't have understood from description anyway, and that you only learn by living inside the place for long enough that your body absorbs them the way it absorbs cold or heat. The first is the sound. Versailles is never quiet. You knew it would be busy. 4,000 people in residence, the administrative machinery of France, visitors and petitioners and tradespeople and servants, but you didn't know what that meant in acoustic terms. The stone floors and high ceilings and the vast corridors create a specific echo that is not like any echo you've heard before. It takes the noise of thousands of footsteps and conversations and moving furniture and slammed doors and multiplies it and reflects it in ways that mean you can never precisely locate a sound. You hear something, you look up. The something is already somewhere else. The building eats sound and redistributes it at night, and you're sleeping in a room above the north wing, a room about the size of a large wardrobe shared with 2 other workshop assistants. The sounds don't stop. They change. The daytime noise of bureaucracy and commerce gives way to the nighttime noise of the court at leisure, which is not, in most respects, quiet leisure. Card parties that run until 3 in the morning. Music from the apartments of the higher nobility that drift through the walls. Occasional shouting. Once, in your second week, what sounded very much like someone crying in the corridor for a sustained period, and nobody opened any doors. You lie on your narrow mattress and listen to Versailles breathe. The second thing, the food, or rather, the distance between the food and the eating, between the preparation and the consumption, between the kitchen, which is everything, and the table, which is performance. You see the King's Supper once by accident. This is in your 3rd week. You've been sent to collect a pigment order from a supplier in the service wing, a roundabout route through the back passages of the palace that most visitors never see. The back passages are where the work of Versailles actually happens, the tunnels and staircases through which the invisible army of servants moves, carrying everything that makes the visible spectacle possible: food, laundry, firewood, candles, water, messages, waste. An entire parallel infrastructure, running behind the walls of the grand apartments like blood running through veins. You take a wrong turn. The passages are unmarked. You learn them by experience or mistake, and end up in a wider corridor where something is happening. A procession. The King's Supper, travelling from the kitchen to the royal table. 41 dishes, you will learn later. 41, for one man, alone, seated at a table in the centre of a room while the court watches. Some of the dishes he won't touch. Some he'll eat 3 helpings of. Louis XIV was known, in his younger decades, for an appetite that astonished observers, for the quantity and speed with which he consumed a meal, for the ease with which he ate things that would defeat most men. That had changed. That was changing. But the 41 dishes still came, because the form of the supper was fixed, and the form was not about hunger. The procession moves in silence, which is the strangest part. Men in livery carrying covered dishes, candles accompanying them for warmth and ceremony, and no one speaking. The steam that escapes the dish covers smells extraordinary. Roasted something, herbs, reduced wine, the deep warm smell of food that has been attended to for hours, and then the cold of the corridor takes it immediately, and by the time the dish reaches the royal table, the steam is gone and the food has dropped several degrees from what it was in the kitchen. This is the fundamental physics of dining at Versailles that nobody ever mentions in the histories. The food is cold, not freezing, not inedible, but not what it was. The distance from the kitchens to the table is enormous, measured not just in feet, but in time and ceremony, and the laws of thermodynamics apply equally to the Sun King's soup and to yours. The elaborate silver covers that sit on each dish retain some warmth. Not enough. The king eats cold soup that was very expensive or very complicated and is now cool. You think about this as you watch the procession pass. The man in the portrait with his impossible perfection, sitting down every evening to a dinner that is beautiful and elaborate and slightly disappointing in the way that all meals served cold are slightly disappointing, and eating it alone in public, watched by courtiers who are there as an honour, as a privilege, and who are also there because the machinery of Versailles requires it, because the ritual of the royal supper has been formalized into a performance that cannot be abandoned without consequence. He eats alone, with an audience of hundreds. Is that better or worse than eating alone with no one? You don't know. You eat your own supper in the service corridor with Gaspard and the other assistants. Bread and a stew that is honest and warm and not particularly interesting. And you feel something, not quite gratitude, something more complicated, for the fact that your supper, such as it is at least at the temperature at which it was made. The kitchen is in the south wing, far enough from the royal apartments that the smells, which are considerable, which are at times overwhelming, don't intrude on the rooms where court life happens. This is by design. The design of Versailles involves the systematic concealment of everything necessary. Everything that keeps the palace running, the food, the fires, the water, the waste, is routed through passages and service wings and underground channels that keep it out of sight and out of mind. The kitchen never stops. This is what Marché tells you when he takes you there one afternoon. And you should understand that Marché has no official reason to take you anywhere. He does it because he's been here long enough to find amusement in showing newcomers the things they don't know, and because Gaspard has indicated to him that you are worth the investment of attention. The kitchen never stops because the cooking for 41 dishes at the evening meal begins in the morning and continues through the day in overlapping waves of preparation. Stocks boiling, pastry being made and remade until the technique is correct, sauces that require constant attention, that must be watched and stirred and tasted and adjusted for hours. The roasting of whole animals, not quickly, not the rough roasting of ordinary cooking, but slow and careful and attended. The meat basted at regular intervals, turned at precise times. The heat is tremendous. You feel it from 20 feet away, coming through the doorway like a wall. In summer, Marché says, men pass out from it regularly. In winter, it's the warmest place in Versailles, and in winter, Versailles is very cold, and the kitchen boys know this. And there is a social hierarchy among kitchen boys that is entirely determined by proximity to the fire. The bottom of that hierarchy is the child who turns the spit. You see him immediately, a boy of maybe 9 or 10 sitting on a low stool, one hand on the mechanism that rotates the spit over the main fire. His face is red. His face has been red for months, you'd guess. The particular permanent redness of skin that is regularly too close to intense heat for too long. He doesn't look up when you enter. He watches the meat turn and turns the mechanism and watches the meat turn and turns the mechanism. He is not, technically, turning the spit manually. There are clockwork mechanisms for the most important roasting, expensive constructions of weights and gears that turn the spit automatically and evenly. But the mechanism requires supervision and occasional manual assistance when the weight runs down, and the supervision is this boy's job, and the supervision requires being very close to the fire for the entirety of his working day. His hands on the mechanism are not the hands of a 9-year-old who has an easy life. The knuckles are cracked and dry. The fingertips have the slight discoloration of repeated minor burns. He has learned to keep them curled away from the metal parts that get hot. He doesn't notice you. Or if he does, he doesn't show it. You are not food. You're not fire. You're not relevant. You watch him for a moment. Marché says nothing. He's watching you watch the boy. How long does he do that, you ask? The spit watch. 8, 10 hours, depending. How old is he? Marché shrugs. Hard to say. They come young. Parents bring them when they're hungry enough. The kitchen feeds them, not much else. He pauses. In a year he'll be promoted, move off the spit, learn the simpler preparations, peeling, portioning, that kind of thing. And if he doesn't, he stays on the spit until the next one comes along. You look back at the boy on his stool. He has turned the mechanism approximately 8,000 times today. He'll turn it several thousand more before the evening meal is served. He'll go to sleep tonight with the smell of smoke in his clothes and the memory of heat on his face, and he will come back tomorrow and do it again. And upstairs, 41 dishes away, the Sun King will sit down to a supper that is slightly cold and will eat it, watched by hundreds of courtiers who consider it an honour to stand there. The gap between the portrait and the body underneath, the gap between the image and the reality, the gap goes all the way down. The medical file on Louis XIV, the Journal de Santé du Roi kept by his physicians, was not a secret document, or rather, it was not meant to be secret in the way that secrets imply shame. The physicians recorded everything because everything mattered, because the body of the king was a matter of state, because what happened to this body affected the governance of 20 million people. The file was thorough and specific and written in the clinical Latin of 17th century medicine. Marché has never seen the file. He doesn't need to. He's been in this building for 20 years, and what the physicians write in Latin, the household knows in French from observation. He tells you in pieces, over the course of several weeks. Start with 1647. Louis is 9 years old. He nearly dies. Smallpox, which takes children of every rank and does not check titles before selecting its victims. The smallpox. Scars are slight. The outbreak is not the worst kind, and the physicians manage it as well as 17th century physicians manage anything, which is to say with prayer and bloodletting and the occasional correct decision by accident. But they're there, under the white lead, under the rouge. Faintly, under very good northern studio light, Rigaud can see them, has seen them, has chosen, as painters of this era choose, not to see them on the canvas. 1658. Louis is 19, a fever so severe that his death is widely expected. His mother prays. His ministers are already, quietly, making contingency plans. The fever breaks. Louis survives. He's in bed for weeks afterward, weak in a way that he finds apparently humiliating. A young man who has built his identity around physical prowess and performance, confined to a bed while people hover and worry. He recovers. He is, afterward, extremely reluctant to admit illness. He will continue to be reluctant for the rest of his life. By now he is 47. The fistula announces itself, an anal abscess, the kind that in ordinary men of the time is treated with varying success and occasional disaster. In the king, the treatment involves the construction of a special surgical instrument, the bistoury royal, the royal lancet, designed specifically for this case, and a procedure conducted under the very particular pressure of the fact that you are cutting into the body of the most powerful man in France, and anything you do wrong will be the last thing you ever do. The surgery is a success. 68 courtiers and officials present or in adjacent rooms, because this is the king, because the king's body is not private. The chief surgeon, Felix de Tassy, is afterward given a title, land, and a great deal of money. He deserves at least some of it. The procedure he developed would be copied and used on other patients for decades, and the survival rate was good. The healing was long and complicated and painful, and again in the way of a man who finds vulnerability intolerable, conducted as invisibly as possible from the public record. The king attended meetings from his bed, he signed documents, he received visitors in a position that the visitors understood but did not acknowledge. The court adapted. The court always adapts. What the surgery left behind, a scar that never fully resolved, an intermittent discomfort that would punctuate the rest of his life, a slight modification to the way he walks, nothing dramatic, nothing the portrait suggests, but visible if you're looking for it and know what to look for. 1696. The teeth. The teeth were going for years before 1696. The particular catastrophe of that year was an extraction, a molar, upper left, performed by the royal dentist, who was not unskilled but who was operating in an era before anaesthesia, before proper instruments, before the germ theory of infection, and who was also operating on the King of France, which introduced a pressure that may have affected the precision of the work. The extraction took part of the bone. This happens in dentistry of this era more than it should. The roots of certain teeth extend deeply, and in a jaw that has been weakened by previous extractions and the general wear of 60 years, the tooth and the bone can come away together. The result is a passage, medical term oronasal fistula, different from his earlier problem but similar in some structural way that the king probably found grimly appropriate, connecting the oral cavity to the nasal cavity. The passages should not be connected. When they are, food can pass between them. When you eat soup, the soup can travel in directions soup was not meant to travel. The physicians address this as best they can. The king addresses it by continuing to attend to the business of governing France. Because what is the alternative? He eats soup. He drinks wine. The court has learned the particular timing of the royal meals that makes this manageable, and the royal meals are arranged accordingly, and nobody mentions it, and Rigaud paints the jaw as it should be, slightly fuller on the left, the bone intact, the structure of the face suggesting a man whose teeth are all present and whose jaw is undamaged. 1701, the year of the portrait, the year you are here. The king has developed gout, inflammation of the joints, the disease of powerful men who eat and drink in the quantities of powerful men, the uric acid, crystallizing in the ankles and feet, the particular pain of it being precisely the pain of sharp objects grinding against soft tissue from the inside. He walks with his careful, measured step that is partly the high shoes, and partly the gout, and partly the residue of the fistula, and partly 63 years of use. He dances in his dreams, perhaps, the boy who was Apollo. The young king whose dancing was a form of governance, of demonstrating that France was led by a body of extraordinary capability. That body is still there, still his, still capable of getting him across the room, up the stairs, through the 3 hours of the morning ceremony, and the 4 hours of formal audiences, and the evening supper, and the card parties that go late into the night. Not fragile, not defeated, but not the portrait, never the portrait. The portrait is eternal, your first brush to canvas in Rigaud's studio. Not the royal portrait, never the royal portrait, you understand this without being told, is a background. The architectural background of the Louis portrait, the Doric columns, the plinth on which the king stands, the distant suggestion of a space that is both specific and generic, simultaneously the palace and the idea of the palace, the setting that says power without committing to any particular room. Rigaud needs copies. This is the economic reality of his operation, the part that the history books tend to elide when they discuss him as a great master. The 1701 Louis XIV portrait is not one painting. It is the source document for dozens, eventually hundreds, of copies, diplomatic gifts, ceremonial portraits for town halls and churches, versions for ambassadors and foreign courts who need an official likeness of the King of France. Rigaud's studio produces these copies systematically, with the division of labour that would look familiar to a modern factory. Some hands doing the backgrounds, some hands doing the drapery, some doing the secondary accessories. Rigaud himself applying the critical passages. The face. Always the face. And integrating the whole into something that reads as unified. Your job, this first time, is the lower third of the background. The floor and the plinth and the first 3 feet of the column on the left. Gaspar shows you the colour key first, the particular grey of the stone, mixed from lead white, black, a touch of raw umber, and the technique for suggesting marble without fully rendering it, which is a kind of controlled accident. A base coat of grey, then a slightly darker glaze dragged across it in irregular strokes while it's still tacky, producing the irregular patterning of real stone. You have to work quickly. You have to commit to the drag stroke before you know exactly how it will fall. Hesitating gives you a smear, not a vein. Your first attempts are wrong, too even, too deliberate. The veining looks painted, which is a damning quality in a painting of stone. Don't think, Gaspar says. The stone doesn't think. Drag and leave it. You drag and leave it. Better. You spend most of a morning on the floor of one background. By early afternoon, your neck aches from leaning over the horizontal canvas. Your right hand is cramping slightly. A different grip than pigment grinding, the brush requiring a lighter hold, more flexibility in the fingers, a constant micro-adjustment to the angle that the grinding muller doesn't demand. The paint on your sleeve is grey, and the paint on your forehead apparently is also grey, from where you pushed your hair back without thinking. Gaspar looks at the morning's work when you stand back. He looks for a while. Long enough that you start to want to say something, to fill the silence with an explanation or an apology, and you stop yourself, because you know that speaking first here is a mistake. The top section, he says finally, pointing at the upper quarter of your morning's work. Too light. The column throws a shadow there and you've left it too open. I'll fix it. The rest is acceptable. He picks up the canvas, angles it toward the window. The marble reads, the joins are clean. He puts it down. Fix the shadow. Acceptable. You fixed the shadow. By the time you leave the studio that evening, you've added 8 square inches to the background of a copy of the most famous portrait of the 17th century. 8 square inches of stone floor that no one will ever specifically notice. That every person who looks at the finished portrait will see without seeing, the way you hear the foundation of the piece of music without thinking about individual notes. You're not proud of 8 square inches, but you're not proud either. There's a woman who works in the corridor outside Rigaud's studio. Her name is Hélène, and her job is to clean the floors of the north wing, which she does every morning before the studios open and every evening after they close. She uses a mop with a head of flax fibre that she soaks in a bucket of water mixed with vinegar. and the smell of the vinegar travels ahead of her and announces her coming. You learn her timing inside 2 weeks. You learn the timing of everyone who works in the service passages, because the service passages are your world now, the actual working Versailles, the one behind the facade, and timing in the service passages is how you navigate. Helene is perhaps 40, perhaps more. Her face has the particular weathering of outdoor exposure in the lower half, and relative smoothness in the upper half that speaks of someone who spent years working outside before coming inside, and who remembers what outside felt like. She moves quickly, efficiently, with the economy of motion of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has calculated the exact minimum energy required. She doesn't speak to you for the first 3 weeks. This is normal. The service hierarchy at Versailles has its own complexity and its own protocols, and a new workshop assistant occupies an uncertain position in it. Above the kitchen boys, below the established household staff, roughly equivalent to a junior footman but not quite. The comparison breaking down because you're not in service to the palace exactly. You're in service to a painter who is in service to the palace, which puts you in a kind of professional intermediate zone. On the first day of the 4th week, she says, as she passes you in the corridor, "Your shoes." You look down. Your shoes have tracked grey paint on the floor she just cleaned. "I'm sorry," you say. She looks at the prints. She looks at you. She goes back to her bucket and mops the prints without comment. The next morning you wrap your shoes in rags before leaving the studio. The rags are an embarrassment. You look absurd, shuffling through the corridor with your feet bound in old cloth. But the floor stays clean. Helene sees you the following morning and says nothing, but she slows her mopping slightly when she passes you, which you eventually decide means she's noticed. Small acknowledgements, the currency of the service world. What you learn from watching her, and from the others like her, the women who carry water, the men who haul firewood, the boys who empty chamber pots, is the arithmetic of invisibility. They're everywhere. Without them, within 24 hours, Versailles ceases to function. The fires go cold, the tables go uncovered, the hallways become navigable obstacles. The whole spectacular machinery of the court simply stops. They are nowhere. They are below the level at which the court notices things. They exist in the pauses between the things that are recorded and remembered. They have no portrait. They will have no portrait. Nobody is painting their hands, which are rough and red and cracked across the knuckles from the cold water and the vinegar and the daily repetition of the same motions. You think about this while you grind pigments. You think about the white lead going onto the king's face every morning. Smooth, perfect, covering everything. You think about what's under the white lead, and then you think about what's under that, under the king's face, under the king's body, what's under the whole production. The boy on the spit stool, Helene and her vinegar bucket, the women in Brittany who cut their hair so that it could become a wig so that the King of France could look like the King of France. The painting is built in layers. Everything is built in layers. 6 weeks into your time in the studio, Rigaud talks to you directly for the first time. This is not a snub, the first 6 weeks. It's architecture. Rigaud's studio runs on a hierarchy of attention. Who gets how much of the master's time, when, for what purpose, and a new boy just arrived from another painter's workshop occupies the bottom tier until something moves him upward. You've been moved upward by the backgrounds, by the acceptable marble work, by the not quite rightness that got fixed and became right, and by the fact that you fix things without being told twice. he finds you working on drapery. Drapery is the other major background element. The heavy fabric behind and beneath the king, the deep red curtain that appears in the portrait and in its copies, and that requires a specific technique to render. Not just colour. The colour is relatively simple. Red lake over a white ground, the precise mixture that Gaspar has established, and that you're to reproduce exactly, but light and shadow, the complex three-dimensional mathematics of fabric that folds and hangs and catches the light at the peaks of its folds and falls into darkness in its valleys. You're working on a shadow, not the shadow of the drapery itself, but the shadow at the edge of the drapery, where it meets the column and the two forms create a compound darkness that is neither simply the absence of light nor simply dark. It has colour in it. The shadow in red drapery is not grey. It's a deep greenish brown, the complement of the red, the physics of coloured light creating this unexpected darkness that painters learn to see and non-painters never notice. You've put in the base shadow. You're deciding whether to glaze it, whether the warm, transparent layer over the cool, deep tone will give you the vibration you're looking for, or whether it will muddy. What are you thinking? Rigaud is standing behind you. You didn't hear him come in. He's looking at the canvas, not at you. I'm thinking about the glaze, you say. Whether the shadow has enough cool in it to carry a warm layer without losing depth. Silence. He picks up the red lake, holds it to the light, puts it down. What does Gaspar say? Gaspar hasn't seen this section yet. What would he say? You think about this, honestly, not as a test. He'd say to glaze it. He'd say the deep tone needs the warm over it to stop the shadow reading as simply flat. He'd say a flat shadow is a drawing, not a painting. Rigaud looks at the canvas again, then at you. His expression is what it always is, not warm, not cold, professional in a way that has become his character over decades of professional work. He has painted more than 2,000 portraits by this point in his career. He will paint several hundred more before he dies. He doesn't get surprised by canvases very often. He's right, Rigaud says. Glaze it. He walks away. That is the conversation. You glaze it. The shadow comes to life in the way Gaspar said it would. The warm, transparent layer producing exactly the vibration you wanted. The depth increasing rather than muddying. You look at it for a moment after you've finished. Gaspar comes over and looks at it too. Better, he says. You don't say anything, but you feel something warm and unreasonable in your chest that you recognize from the drawing master in Leon, from the specific moment when you did something correctly that you hadn't been able to do before and which you now know you can do again. The thing about painting at Versailles, and this takes weeks to fully understand, weeks during which the thing is happening to you without your being able to name it. The thing is that you are surrounded at all times by the consequences of image, by what image does. Every room you walk through is designed, not just decorated, designed in the precise sense of having been conceived as a complete visual argument, a statement about power and divinity and the relationship between the two. The Hall of Mirrors, which you see once when you take a wrong turn and end up in a corridor overlooking it, is not beautiful in the way that a landscape or a woman's face is beautiful. It is overwhelming in the way that an argument is overwhelming when every piece of it is correct and nothing can be refuted. The mirrors amplify the light. The gold amplifies the gold. The paintings on the ceiling amplify the painting on the ceiling. The whole room is a machine for producing a specific feeling in the people who enter it, and the feeling is diminishment, not cruelty, not threat. Simply the very clear communication that you are small and that the force that built this room is not. Louis XIV built this room, approved every inch of it, walked through it 10,000 times at different ages, in different states, and saw in it what he needed to see, the evidence that he was right about himself. You think about the painting in the studio and about the man in the painting and about the room the painting hangs in, and you think, this is what artists do here. Not serve, not simply render. They are part of the argument. The painting is a piece of the machine. The portrait of the Sun King is not a representation of Louis XIV any more than the Hall of Mirrors is a place to see your reflection. It's a statement, an argument, a piece of political theology rendered in oil and canvas, and your 8 square inches of marble floor are part of it. This is the thing about working in the service of great power. The thing nobody told you and that Marché won't say directly, and the Gaspard has said sideways in a dozen different ways without saying it plainly, that you're not separate from what you're serving. You're inside it. Your hands are producing it. The distinction between the painter and the argument he paints is smaller than you thought. You grind the pigments. The portrait gets made. November arrives with rain. Not lion rain, which is honest and direct. Versailles rain, which comes at angles and finds the gaps in the north wing windows, and produces a fine persistent dampness in the studio that is not exactly cold and not exactly warm, and that is exactly wrong for oil paint, which needs specific conditions to dry correctly, and which in damp conditions can remain tacky for days. The surface skin forming, but the layers underneath staying soft, movable, vulnerable. Gaspard deals with this by installing a brazier in the centre of the studio and opening the windows slightly on the side away from the rain, creating a circulation of air that is both drier and warmer than what comes in from the outside. The smoke from the brazier goes out the cracked window, and the warmth stays in and the paint dries in approximately the correct time, and the system works as long as you tend the brazier, which is, in rotation, everyone's job. You tend the brazier at night. This is technically not required. The studio is closed at night, but there are canvases at a critical drying stage, backgrounds that Rigaud needs to glaze tomorrow, draperies that need to have cured overnight before the next layer goes on. And if the warmth drops significantly while they're wet, you'll lose a day's work to puckering and cracking. Gaspard does it the first night and shows you the routine, and the next night it's yours. Alone in the studio at night with a brazier and the canvases. The north windows are black. Through the crack where Gaspard has set the ventilation, you can hear rain on the courtyard stones and the distant sound of the palace at night. Not quiet, never quite quiet, but quieter than the day. The sound a lower frequency, deeper, more like breathing. The canvases in the firelight look different from the canvases in daylight. The warm orange of the brazier changes every colour. The reds deepen, the blues shift toward grey, the whites take on a golden cast. You learn quickly not to try to work in this light. The colour you put on in firelight will be wrong in the morning. You're here to tend the fire, not to paint. So you sit on a low stool near the brazier and look at the backgrounds, at the drapery sections you've worked on, at the mannequin still on its platform, the blue velvet looking almost black in the firelight, the ermine going golden, and at the full-size copy of the portrait that Rigaud has been assembling over the past weeks, the one that will go to a foreign court when it's finished, that will hang in some throne room in a country where no one has ever seen Louis XIV, and will communicate something about France and power and the king, and will communicate it successfully because Rigaud is very good at his job, and the form he's working in has been refined over decades into something that operates almost below the level of conscious response. You look at the portrait in firelight for a long time. The face, Rigaud's work, is complete. The eyes look back at you from the warm shadows of the studio with a particular quality that makes Rigaud's faces different from other painters' faces. The sense of something behind them. Not just a surface well rendered. Something interior. Something that suggests the portrait knows it's being looked at. Which is the achievement, isn't it? The achievement of the portrait and of the king and of the whole machine that produces both. The sense of being seen by something that matters, that when Louis XIV looks down from that canvas at the foreign court where it will hang, the people below are being assessed by France, by power, by the idea of a king who is France. You're 17 years old, sitting on a stool in a room in Versailles at midnight, tending a fire and looking at a painting. The painting is bigger than you are. You know this in a way you didn't know it when you arrived. The painting is bigger than Rigaud, and bigger than the king, and bigger than the lies it tells about its subject. It has become something that the king can no longer access directly, that even Rigaud, who made it, can no longer fully see, because they're inside it, and you can't see the thing you're inside. You can see it, a little, because you're new, because Lion is still close enough that you can stand briefly outside the machine and look at it from there. In another month you won't be able to do that. You put another piece of wood on the brazier and go back to watching the paint dry. The day you see the king's face without the wig is an accident, and you don't speak of it for years. You're in the wrong corridor at the wrong time, and a door opens that you weren't expecting to open, and for a moment, half a moment, you see, he is sitting in a chair. He's wearing a loose robe. The wig is on a stand beside him, and his head is bare, and the physician is taking his pulse and speaking quietly, and the king is looking out the window. His hair, his real hair, what remains of it, is white and sparse and very short, close to the skull. Without the wig, the shape of his head is different than you expected, smaller at the top, the specific reduction that age makes to a face when the hair goes. His jaw, without the powder and the rouge and the patches, is his jaw. The left side is slightly wrong. He doesn't see you. The door closes. You stand in the corridor for a moment with your brushes in their case and the smell of turpentine on your hands, and you think, I have seen him. Not the portrait, not the ceremony. The man before the wig is on and after the powder goes on, in the gap between one construction and the next. He looked tired. He looked his age. He looked, for that half a moment, like a man in a chair in the morning who hadn't yet become the Sun King. Then the door closed, and the Sun King returned, and you went back to the studio and ground pigments. You don't tell Gaspard. You don't tell Marché. You think about it for days, and then you stop thinking about it, and it becomes one of those things you carry, a thing seen that doesn't have a frame yet, that you don't know what to do with. You put it in the marble floor of the backgrounds, in the shadow of the drapery, in the 8 square inches and the next 8 square inches and all the infinitely replaceable square inches of the copies that keep coming. You put it in the paint and you leave it there. The thing about Versailles that nobody says directly, but that everyone who works here long enough comes to understand. It is an argument against the body. The body is small, and it smells, and it ages, and it fails. The body gets cold and hungry and sick, and its jaw rots and its ankles ache, and its breath tells the truth about what's underneath the powder. The body is the problem that Versailles was built to solve, and Versailles solves it. Partially, imperfectly, at enormous cost. The solution requires 4,000 people working in shifts. It requires the boy on the spit stool and Helene and her vinegar bucket and the wig makers and the lead white and the red lake and Rigaud and you. It requires 41 dishes served slightly cold every evening. It requires a ceremonial mourning that turns a man in a chair into a king over the course of 3 hours. And it requires the portrait above all. Because everything else is temporary. The ceremony ends, the wig comes off, the powder is washed away, but the portrait stays. The portrait goes to foreign courts. It goes to churches and town halls and noble houses. It travels to places the king will never go and lives there for centuries after the king is dust. The portrait is the argument that wins. Louis XIV understood this more completely than almost anyone before him. He understood that image was not subordinate to power. Image was power, in a sense more literal than metaphor. If France believed the king was the sun, eternal, radiant, source of all light, then France would act accordingly. The belief produced the reality. The portrait produced the king. You are helping to produce the king. You, Jean-Baptiste Morel, 17 years old from Lyon, with paint on your fingers and a cramping right hand and shoes that you now wrap in rags before leaving the studio. You are part of the machinery that makes Louis XIV real. This is either terrible or magnificent. You are still deciding which. December. The first real cold of winter arrives at Versailles with the particular conviction of cold that has been building for months and is finally ready to make its argument fully. The windows ice on the inside. The water in your basin freezes overnight. You wake to the sound of cracking when the expansion of the ice pushes against the pottery, and you break the surface with your fist, your knuckles immediately objecting to the temperature of the water underneath, and you wash your face fast. The cold, a specific kind of pain that wakes you up more thoroughly than any bell. The studio is cold in the mornings until the brazier catches. Gaspard lights it first thing, kneeling on the floor with the flint and tinder, his breath coming out in visible clouds, the particular combination of the smell of cold paint and cold stone and cold wood, and then the first warmth of the fire beginning to come through. Your hands stiffen in the cold. Not badly. You're young and your circulation is good, but the fingers lose some of their fine movement in the first hour before the brazier heats the room, and you learn to do the rough preparatory work in the morning, the pigment grinding and the canvas priming, and to save the detail work for the afternoon when your hands have come back to themselves. The light changes too. The December light through the north windows is lower and colder than October's light, the sun making a shallower arc across the sky, the shadows longer, the quality of illumination harsher and more definitive. Gaspard adjusts. He positions certain canvases differently, seeking the light's new angles. He adds candles to the studio at mid-afternoon when the daylight starts to go, clustering them around the most critical work. Candles are not daylight. Every painter knows this. The warm flame distorts colours in ways that only experience teaches you to compensate for, and experience here means the particular experience of working in candlelight, long enough that your eye has calibrated to it, has learned to add what the candle removes. You don't have that experience yet. Gaspard sometimes looks at your afternoon work in the morning light and says a word quietly, and you know what the word means. The colours shifted while you were working and you didn't catch it. You catch it more and more toward the end, but not always. Your last week in the studio, Rigaud gives you a canvas. Not a background, not drapery, not a copy element. A small canvas, about the size of a book, stretched on a simple frame with a single piece of instruction. Paint something from what you've seen here. You look at the canvas for a day. You look at it in the morning and you look at it in the evening and you don't pick up a brush. Gaspard notices. He doesn't say anything, which is his way of saying everything. On the second day you begin. You paint the mannequin. Not as it looks in the daylight studio, dressed and composed, performing its version of the royal portrait. You paint it as you saw it that first night, by the light of the brazier. The blue velvet going almost black in the firelight, the ermine catching the orange warmth at its edges, the wig on the padded head, the face that isn't there, the dark holes where the eyes aren't. You paint the shadows of the room behind it, the shapes of the canvases leaning against the walls barely suggested, the single source of light from the low left, and you paint what you couldn't see but knew was there, the body inside the robes, the armature, the wood and padding and wire that give the mannequin its shape, that fill the velvet so it falls correctly, that suggest the presence of a man without being one. You don't paint the man, you paint the shape of the space where the man should be. It takes 4 days. By the end your hands are accurate in ways they weren't at the beginning. The shadows in the velvet fall correctly. The ermine reads as fur rather than paint. The darkness at the centre, where the face isn't, has the specific quality of absence rather than simply emptiness. Rigaud looks at it for a long time. Then he looks at you. You understand something, he says. You don't understand everything yet, but you understand something. He puts the canvas down. When you have your own workshop, he says, you'll know more of what that is. He walks away. Gaspard is watching from across the room. He raises his eyebrows, not praise exactly. Acknowledgement. The slight adjustment in his expression that means, this one. You look at the canvas. The mannequin looks back from it with its absent face, dressed in the garments of a king. The light falling on the velvet the way firelight falls on velvet at midnight in Versailles, which is unlike any other light you have seen before or since. Your last morning in the studio, before you go back to Paris and to Bertin's workshop, and to the horses and the middling portraits and the rest of your apprenticeship, you go up. Not to any planned elevated place, not to a designated viewpoint. The palace has those, the roof terraces, the balconies of the royal apartments, the places from which the gardens are meant to be seen in their full geometry. Those places require permission. You go up the way you've gone everywhere in Versailles, through the service stairs, through the unmarked doors, through the passages that the people who clean the floors know, and the people who live in the decorated rooms don't. 3 flights above the north wing, there's a window. Just a window. Not a terrace, not a designed viewpoint. A working window used for ventilation, with a ledge wide enough to sit on if you're careful, the frame cold under your palms as you push it open. You sit on the ledge with your feet inside and the cold December air coming in from outside, and you look. The gardens. You've not seen the gardens properly from ground level. The scale of them from ground level defeats you. You can see the nearest section, the closest fountain, the immediate geometry of the gravel paths, and your eye keeps stopping there, unable to process the rest. From up here, you see it whole. Versailles gardens are not from above what they are at ground level. From ground level there are a series of individual spaces, the fountain here, the bosque there, the long canal glimpsed at the end of the central axis. From above they are an argument. The same argument as the Hall of Mirrors, the same argument as the portrait, a single unified statement about order and power and the subjugation of nature to the will of a man who considers himself the sun. Everything radiates. That's the first thing you see that you can't see from inside the geometry. The paths, the hedges, the flower beds, the water features. Everything radiates from the palace, from the king's bedchamber, which is the literal physical centre from which the axes extend. The Sun King at the centre. Light going out in every direction. The gardens are empty in December. The fountains are shut off. The water was drained before the first freeze. The gravel is white with frost. The topiary stands in its geometric shapes without leaves, the bare structure showing, the architecture of living things that have been trained since birth into forms they would not naturally choose. The trees. You look at the trees longest. The trees at Versailles are not trees in the way that the oak in your drawing master's courtyard in Lyon is a tree. The trees at Versailles are trees that have been worked on, pruned into walls, trained into tunnels, shaped at their tops into flat planes that create outdoor rooms with green ceilings. Some of them are 200 years old. They were young when the decisions were made about what they would become, and they've been maintained in that becoming ever since. Year by year, the gardeners with their tools keeping the trees from resolving into their natural shapes, keeping them in the shape that the argument requires. Beautiful. Undeniably beautiful. But every tree here is a tree that was told what to be and became it. You sit in the window for a long time. Below you, behind you, Versailles continues. The ceremony of the morning is somewhere in the palace. The physicians, the first gentleman, the wig being placed at the correct angle, the white lead being applied. The brazier in the studio is being tended. Helene and her vinegar bucket are somewhere in the service passages. The boy on the spit stool is turning the mechanism. The portrait in the studio is drying. This is France. This is the greatest kingdom in Europe. This is the image and the reality and the gap between them. And the gap is what you've spent 3 months learning to live inside. You came here knowing how to grind pigments and prime canvases. You're leaving knowing something else, something you don't have words for yet that will take years of other work and other workshops before it fully resolves. You're leaving knowing that the portrait is not the lie, and the body is not the truth. They're both true. They're both real. The king in the chair with his white hair is real. The Sun King in the blue velvet is real. Rigaud didn't lie. He painted an argument. He painted the thing that a kingdom needs to believe in order to function, and it's an extraordinary thing, and it required extraordinary skill. And the fact that the man underneath was 63 years old with a damaged jaw and gouty ankles doesn't make the portrait less real. It just means that reality is more layered than you thought. You learned this from painting stone floors, from dragging a brush over wet paint in the controlled accident of marble, from 8 square inches that nobody will ever specifically see. You climb down from the window ledge, close the window against the December cold, go back to the studio, pick up your brushes. You're on the road back to Paris by the afternoon, in a coach that takes the bad road to Sèvres in reverse, your spine negotiating again with the ruts, the case of brushes on your lap. Paris in December smells different from Paris in the summer. Colder, harder, the particular acrid sharpness of coal smoke in cold air. The streets are already dark by the time you arrive. The lamplighters have been out. Bertin's workshop is exactly as you left it. The smell of his particular oil. He uses a different mixture from Rigaud, heavier, slower to dry, hits you before you're through the door. The canvas is in progress. The good horse portraits along one wall. Bertin looks at you when you come in. He looks at you the way masters look at apprentices returning from significant experiences, with the careful eye of someone assessing what changed. Well, he says. I learned things, you say. Evidently, your hands are different. You look down at your hands, the stain on the fingernails, the new callus on the inside of the right forefinger, from 3 months of holding brushes at different angles. Rigaud says I understand something, you say. He didn't say what. Bertin laughs, a real laugh, the first one you've heard from him. That is exactly what Rigaud would say. He goes back to his canvas. Tomorrow you start on Madame Villeneuve. 3rd portrait in 2 years. She always wants the same thing, which is to look younger than she is. You'll understand the technical requirements. I've been practicing the technique, you say. He looks at you over his shoulder, sees something in your face. Yes, he says. I imagine you have. You sleep that first night in Paris in a real bed, your own narrow cot in the back of the workshop, which after 3 months of the wardrobe-sized room above the north wing feels enormous, and you lie on your back in the dark with Paris sounding around you. Not Versailles. Different sounds. The more honest noise of a city that is not performing anything. That is just a city. People living inside it. The carts and the dogs and the taverns and the church bells marking hours. Your hands are still stained. They'll wash out eventually. In a week, maybe 2, the smalt will fade and the lead will go and the specific grey of Versailles stone will disappear from your fingernails. Your hands will become, gradually, hands in another workshop in another city, grinding different pigments, producing different work. But you'll carry the mannequin for a long time, the blue velvet in firelight, the absent face, the shape of the space where the man should be. You'll carry the boy on the spit stool, the way he didn't look up, the economy of his attention reduced to its smallest possible scope, the meat, the fire, the mechanism, the next hour, survival in the terms available to him. You'll carry Gaspard saying drag and leave it, and the moment when you stopped thinking and the marble happened, and you'll carry the half a second through the open door, the man in the chair before he became the portrait, the white hair, the tired jaw, the ordinary particular face of a person who's been told since birth that he is extraordinary and has organized an enormous amount of the material world around. The project of making that claim credible. It's not cruelty what Rigaud did. It's not flattery in the cheap sense. It's something more complicated. It's an understanding that some truths are too large and too impractical for canvas. That the truth of a kingdom isn't the truth of a body. That the image has to carry what the body cannot. You believe this and you don't believe it. You'll spend decades deciding. For now, Paris is breathing around you. December cold coming in under the door. The candle you meant to blow out before getting into bed has burned down on its own, and the room is fully dark. Tomorrow there is Madame Villeneuve and her familiar requirements. The technical challenge of making her look younger than she is, which is a challenge you now understand from the inside, which is a challenge you've spent 3 months contributing to on behalf of the most powerful man in the world. You know how to do this. You close your eyes. The smells of the day fade. Paris, coal smoke, the cold, the linseed oil that is already in the studio air. Under them, faintly, the ghost of turpentine and vinegar, and the specific warm mineral smell of pigments ground fine. Tomorrow, but not yet. Right now there's just the dark and the sounds of the city and the particular rest that comes at the end of 3 months of learning something that can't be unlearned. Your hands on the blanket, still stained a little, still smelling of the work, still yours. The portrait of Louis XIV by Hyacinthe Rigaud, painted in 1701, hangs today in the Louvre. The king in the blue velvet, the ermine, the white silk stockings, the hand on the hip, the sceptre. It is the portrait you know, even if you didn't know you knew it. It is on the postcards and the book covers and the gift shop calendars. It is the image that the word king produces in the mind of anyone who has seen it even once. Louis XIV died 14 years after it was painted, in 1715. He was 76 years old, which was exceptional for the era and for a body that had been through what his had been through. He died of gangrene, which started in his leg, which the physicians could not stop, being the physicians they were with the tools they had. He was conscious until nearly the end. He remained, in the accounts that survive, composed. He was not afraid, or he did not show fear. The distinction, at this level of practice performance, may not be meaningful. The portrait outlived him by 300 years and counting. The boy on the spit stool. Nobody recorded his name. He's in no portrait. He exists in the history of Versailles the way the cold exists in the history of painting, as the condition under which the work happened, present in every brushstroke, visible in none of them. The women in Brittany who cut their hair, same. Hélène with her vinegar bucket, same. This is how it works. This is how it has always worked. The image rises. The labour that built the image disappears into the image. The portrait is the Sun King in his immortal blue velvet, and the portrait is also the boy on the spit stool, and the woman with the bucket and the cold water in the basin every morning. You carried all of it when you left. The brushes in their case, the hands with the stain that faded but left something underneath that didn't, the marble floor and the drapery and the 8 square inches, the painting of the mannequin which Rigaud kept, which he showed years later to someone whose name wasn't recorded either, and said, "A boy made this." He understood something. He didn't yet understand what. That's enough. That has always been enough. To understand something. To carry it forward into the next workshop and the next portrait and the next canvas. To keep your hands moving and your eyes open and your mouth closed in the moments that require it. To drag and leave it. Outside, wherever you are, the city is doing what cities do. Moving through its darkness. Cycling through its sounds. The bars of light under doors and the footsteps in corridors and the distant noise of other people living their separate invisible lives. You are warm enough, you are safe enough, you have made it through another day, which is more than the boy on the spit stool could always say with certainty when he went to sleep, and it is more than the women in Brittany with their cut hair, and it is more than the soldiers in the hospital at Greenwich with their years at sea and their lost eyes. Let it be enough. Let the sounds fade. Let the dark come in the way it came into Rigaud's studio that night in December, soft and complete, the brazier down to its last coals, the paint on the canvases finally dry and settled. Let your hands rest. They have done their work. Let the portrait go. Let it hang in its room, eternal and composed, the blue velvet in the cold museum air. Let the Sun King stand in his impossible posture, with his hand on his hip, looking out at 3 centuries of people who've come to look at him. He's there if you need him. He's always there. But right now, in this moment, the only thing you need is the dark and the warmth and the slow, soft dissolution of everything that was urgent this morning and will be urgent again tomorrow, but is for now at rest. The brushes can wait. The pigments will still be there. The canvas will hold. Let sleep take you the way it took Jean-Baptiste Morel in his cot in Paris, with the smell of turpentine still on his hands, and the memory of blue velvet in firelight somewhere in the back of his mind, on the far side of a long road, and 3 months and something he'd spent his whole life understanding more of. You've earned this. All of you. Every person listening to this in the dark, wherever you are, whatever your 8 square inches are, you've earned this. Let it come. Let it come. Good night.